After Ukraine, the USA put a signature on the end of the European Union. How the Western alliance is finally disintegrating at the hands of President Biden. US policy of industrial subsidies will have dire consequences for Europe. Brussels faces an existential challenge. Europe's industry is in a state of emergency due to rising energy and natural gas prices, but also Washington's new subsidies for American companies, Politico argues in its report ahead of the crucial EU-US meeting on Monday, December 5th. US President Joe Biden, under the Inflation Reduction Act, announced in August, is now providing $369 billion in subsidies to the green industry. Former Vice President Al Gore this weekend described the law as the most important climate legislation ever passed by any country. Not everyone is so impressed, though. This new bill requires much of the technology, such as electric car batteries and so on, to be made in North America, writes geopolitical analyst Uriel Araujo in an analysis on the website Southfront. The consequences for Europe are dire. This, of course, has dire consequences for Europe. The issue is so serious that French President Emmanuel Macron, who met with Joe Biden at the White House on Thursday, December 1st, warned his American counterpart that the issue could divide the West, while he described the subsidies as over-aggressive towards European companies. Although Gore earlier this week urged Europeans not to fight the US on this issue but rather participate in it, there is indeed an ongoing trade dispute between Washington and the European Union. First, European officials have accused the US of profiting from the current Russian-Ukrainian conflict, while Europeans themselves are suffering the most. The US liquefied natural gas LNG industry is certainly enjoying big profits as the European continent prepares for the coming winter and LNG prices soar. History of treason. It's well known that Washington has a long history of betraying its staunchest allies. European leaders certainly have not forgotten the US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and her disparaging words about the EU in the leaked 2014 phone call when she used the word, F-U-C-K, the EU. If this leak revealed a certain attitude of Washington towards its European allies, such an attitude does not seem to have changed much. In the difficult situation that Europe now faces, amid the escalation of military conflict in Eurasia, geopolitical and geoeconomic issues are intertwined. The war in Ukraine began in 2014. Like it or not, the hard truth is that the ongoing conflict in Ukraine actually began 8 years ago with a long-overlooked humanitarian disaster in the Donbass and repeated Ukrainian attacks on civilian populations there. And this conflict, in turn, is rooted in US-led NATO policies of enlargement and encirclement of Russia. However, beyond the geopolitical and military issue, there's also a geoeconomic and energy dispute. In December 2020, Araujo wrote about this angle and how Washington has always wanted the Europeans to buy plenty of American liquid natural gas, which is more expensive actually, even though Russia is in Europe. As such, the US has always actively worked against any Russian-European gas cooperation through a series of legislative measures and sanctions, and here, as is often the case, government corruption and private interests are intertwined with the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the USA. Biden's foreshadowing of this Nord Stream disaster? Although the current conflict in Ukraine has escalated the dramatic rise in energy prices in Europe, this rise began before the end of 2020, and it's known that it could have been at least partially avoided if Nord Stream 2 had not been delayed. However, the Nord Stream pipeline has been lost for good, possibly as a result of the act of sabotage which Biden himself had promised would happen on January 7, 2022. Araujo has written about how post-Nord Stream, Europe and the UK now face inflation, deindustrialization, and a possible recession. So that's the overall context to keep in mind when looking at the current subsidy war and the trade war that seems to be unfolding now. existential challenge. Politico writes that, according to two senior officials, the EU is preparing to roll out a huge range of subsidies to counter the US initiative in a bid to prevent its industry from being disappeared by US rivals. EU industry chief Thierry Breton went so far as to say that Biden's newest subsidy package actually poses an existential challenge to the European economy and industry. An EU diplomat is even quoted in the aforementioned Politico article as saying that the deflation law has changed everything to the point where there are voices in Europe like, is Washington still our ally or not? This may in fact be one of the most fundamental geopolitical questions for the current century. It remains to be seen how European leaders will respond to yet another American aggression. While a new Cold War is taking place, emerging powers around the world are increasingly building multi-alignment, non-alignment, and multilateralism, seeking mutually beneficial relations with Moscow and Beijing while balancing the relationship with Washington. Ursula von der Leyen is panicking. The European Union must adjust its state aid rules to prevent an investment exodus due to a new green energy subsidy package in the US, the president of the European Commission said on today. Competition is good, but this competition must be on equal terms, she said in a speech in the Belgian city of Bruges. The US Inflation Reduction Act should make us think about how we can improve our government assistance frameworks and adapt them to a new global environment, she said. The 27 European Union member bloc fears the $430 billion Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA of the US, with its generous tax cuts, could attract EU businesses and disadvantage European firms from car makers to green technology makers. The issue is on the agenda of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council meeting to be held tomorrow, December 5th. The meeting will be attended by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, and US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, along with European Commission Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis and Greta Vestager. This is from Banking News Greece, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.